Baba Yaga is currently the worst god in SMITE. That sounds like a bold statement, just throwing that out there without even having a scene on the live client yet. And I'm saying this for a good reason. It's because as of now, Baba Yaga has bugs that are basically Morrigan level bad. If it wasn't for those bugs, she could actually be a solid character. And today we're looking into exactly that. First we're going to talk about the bugs that she has, and then we're going to talk about her overall balance at the moment as far as that's possible. Let's begin with the bugs that currently absolutely ruin her. The first and biggest one is in her ultimate, and you can see that right here. What happens is she goes into her ultimate as normal and she does the knockback damage, but then afterwards she is unable to throw her fireballs. That means she is CC immune and can walk around and gets a little bit of a shield, but that is it. And she can't use escapes, she can't do any damage and has to wait out the entire duration of the ultimate. Definitely not a situation you want to be stuck in, and it happens a lot at the moment. As with the rest of the bugs, Hi-Rez is working on a fix. This one may potentially be tied to ping somehow. The second one has a similar impact, though not quite as drastically, on her fighting capabilities. When you store a brew in your consumable slot from her 2, which would allow you to fire the ability twice, then there is a glitch that can happen that simply doesn't allow you to throw out the second potion. You use it, the consumable, and it shows up in your hand basically, but it just doesn't fire, and that can happen multiple times in a row as well. Considering the damage of the 2, that often makes a difference between a kill and an enemy getting away. The third bug is not quite as problematic. This is just regarding her creeping cabin, which can sometimes not stack your items and instead heal you when it's supposed to stack the items and prioritize that. So just a priority glitch that I'm not sure what it's triggered by. I also experienced random game crashes, and there's also a rumored bug about Morrigan transforming into her causing more issues. So there is more on that laundry list that Hi-Rez has to go through. All these bugs are known to Hi-Rez and they're working on them, but at the moment she's still in a very unstable state. And that just makes it very hard to determine her true potential. It's just very, very complicated to actually unleash it, as you run into so many issues while trying to do so. But let's talk about her balance as far as we can. Usual disclaimer here, all of these games are played on 200 plus ping, because I'm playing from Australia in North America, and that can obviously impact the perception and the looks of abilities and everything. So keep that in mind. And likewise, this is obviously learning a very complex character, so you're not going to see her full potential unleashed in this gameplay at all. With that out of the way, I want to say that I really love this character in concept. I think Baba Yaga has a lot of unique aspects, but can still work within the boundaries of SMITE and can be reasonably balanced. However, she will need a lot of polish until that state is actually reached. When it comes to her passive, Creeping Cabin, I think that's a relatively strong passive, a very strong passive in fact, and it is unique. It would obviously work better if it wasn't bugged, but that aside, it definitely gets her towards late game better by allowing stacking items to stack quicker, or helps her sustain better with a 25% heal on full stacks. So there is even potential to build into some sort of health stacking build and experiment with that to benefit more from that percentage. And this as a whole, facilitating different unique build styles that rely on stacking items more than other gods can, is, I think, a very cool mechanic. The cabin itself, walking around in the map, could, in my opinion, be a little less erratic. It has some really strange pathing, often stays very far away, and it takes very long for it to register that Baba Yaga is gone and to follow up. So I think it could be a little bit more like normal pets, just to actually get close to it and get the stacks at a reasonable pacing as well. The first ability is Wild Witchcraft. This is the one that changes its shape randomly with every use and gets additional effects, being extra protections, extra movement speed, slow for enemies, or a silence. The damage component of this ability feels good. It has sufficient damage for clearing, but it doesn't feel completely overwhelming, and it has to be kept on this middle ground in order to be fair because it has such long range, especially in the Y shape. I think the unique targeters that work differently are great. There are cool ways to play around with that, but I have to say that the oval shape feels off, because it's the only one that doesn't start with a line, and it requires you to position completely differently to even clear the wave. Of course, this can throw the enemies off as well and it can be utilized that way, but most of the time it just is annoying for you, makes it easier to miss your clear and accidentally misplace it if you didn't pay attention to the target at all times. So I am not the biggest fan of the oval one not fitting in with the others. The randomized bonus effects vary drastically in strength. So on one hand, for example, you have an area effect plus on-hit silence. It's both. So hitting an enemy silences them for 1 second right away, but if they walk back into the area anywhere, they still get silenced for 1 second. And on the other hand, you have getting some protections while you're in the ability. Those are not the same, and this random strength differential, I think, is a bit of a problem. I think the slow and movement speed are kind of on the same level, but I think especially the silence stands out here as the strongest effect by far, which you can be lucky with or unlucky, and that can really change the outcome of a game. Now, of course, you could be holding the one in order to keep an effect that you want for a specific situation, but unfortunately, it's not really that possible to hold it most of the time, as this is your only reliable clear that you can easily use in any situation. And the ability that you would otherwise use instead is her 2, which also has random effects, and you may be wanting to store something in the 2 at that moment. So it's kind of putting you in this awkward place where you want to save both often and then can't do either. I have to say, I found constantly having to look at the passive annoying. I find it annoying to have to look down to that icon so frequently. And it would be cool if there was a visual effect on Baba Yaga herself, so the player could easily see which ability is going to happen next. It would of course be nice to be able to put the passive icon somewhere else for Baba Yaga specifically, like move it around. That's not possible within the current confines that SMITE's UI settings have. And with that, we are moving on to the second ability, Baba's Brew. This one is the one I have the most issues with. Even outside of the bugs that it has, it just feels clunky and slow. There's an extremely long time frame between pressing the ability button and actually being able to fire the ability, because you have the indicator that shows you which kind of mixture you have first, and then you have to wait. And that same thing still happens if you pick a potion from the inventory as well. And then after that, the projectile speed of the attack is also slow. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not expecting this ability to be super quick and super responsive, just a little bit quicker than what it is right now. Maybe just speeding up the projectile speed would be enough, or maybe just shortening down the startup phase would be enough, but both together just feels bad. In addition to that, the ability currently has a swap mechanic. So you can store one potion, and if you have one potion stored, by right-clicking the ability, it goes into your consumable slot. So far so good, and you'd think you can just use the other one, and then you use the one from your inventory. The problem is that currently the swap mechanic of the ability is bound to the same button as the attack itself. Sounds confusing? That's because it is. So if I have a potion in my inventory that I've stored before, and I use the ability by pressing 2, and then I press 2 again, I would think that's when I fire the ability, but it's not. Instead, pressing 2 again will swap the potion in your inventory with the potion that you're holding in your hand. You can keep pressing 2 and swapping them around, but the only way to actually fire the ability is to click your basic attack button. Depending on PC, it would be a mouse, or console would be whichever button you've bound to a basic attack. This feels super counterintuitive because all other abilities in SMITE basically fire by pressing the button of the ability. If they have multiple instances, you press it multiple times. Now, there is a reason why it's handled this way, because if the swap was put on the right-click cancel instead, like it is with the store, that would lead to you not being able to really cancel the ability when you have 2 potions, because then, yeah, well, you're gonna keep swapping them instead of actually canceling the ability. I don't know if it would be possible to do like a double input where you register 2 right clicks in a row or 2 cancels in a row to cancel the ability, but I doubt that's possible. So this would be a downside you have to live with. You have to accept that you can't cancel the ability and you have to fire the second potion. But in my opinion, that's still better than having to press multiple buttons for the ability, when it just feels super strange to do that and feels super annoying. Feels super confusing for new players to the character that will just think something's glitching out, because that's what I thought first. And yeah, it's just not good this way. Additionally, somebody on Reddit had a really good suggestion. When the 2 is on cooldown, then using the ability while having a potion stored in your item slots, in your consumable slots, should bring up that potion into your hand and allow you to throw it on the second use of that button again. That would minimize the amount of times that you need to use the consumable button instead of just using the ability button, which honestly would feel a lot better, so I fully agree with this suggestion. By the way, this whole issue only exists when you have a potion stored. So if you're using the ability button twice while you don't have a potion stored, it will fire as normal. And that makes it even more confusing because the functionality of the button basically changes depending on what you have in your inventory, and that's just weird. Now, as for the current balance of this ability, I think the damage of it is actually pretty good in late game, though I would argue it's possibly slightly too low in early game. That's because in early game you can't have more than 3 amplifiers, so 3 Eyes of Newt, which would be a maximum of an extra 22.5% damage at the moment. That's definitely not overwhelming. Obviously the damage can't be too high as the ability can be casted twice, but in early game you don't really have the mana or the cooldown to spam this ability with a double throw anyways, so this would be an outlier. You'd burn too much mana or you would have it on cooldown too often for that really to be a massive factor. I could see rank 1 of this ability specifically being weaker so that you can't push the first wave too easily by storing 2 potions, but aside of that I would say a little bit of a damage increase for this wouldn't feel bad, but that might also change if the ability is a little bit easier to hit up a little quicker. That could already be enough in itself. Let's have a look at the third ability, Blast Off. This ability you go under your mortar first and you get damage reduction as well as knockback and knockout immunity, and then afterwards you have a leap. I gotta say that the ability feels a little bit weird. This may be partially due to the ping, it just feels jittery and janky sometimes. But it can be used well against certain enemies. I actually messed this up when I first played it because I didn't really realize that you can kind of utilize this the same way that people used to utilize Thor's 3. Especially the old version was often used just to avoid knockback or knockups. And that's the same thing you can do with Baba Yaga, as the first part of the ability does this. And then you can always choose to just turn around and jump the other way anyways. So this is a very cool specific counter. You could even use this to just reduce high burst. The leap itself feels relatively short considering the extra effort it requires compared to other leaps and the long windup that it has. But this could be offset by just giving the first part of the ability a slight movement speed increase. That way you have a better chance to explode on a target basically, apply the explosion to them because you move to them quicker, and then it doesn't feel that bad that the leap feels a little bit short because you already had some extra ground that you covered beforehand. The damage of this ability is surprisingly high, but only really usable aggressively, so typically with a very tanky bruiser builds or something like that. And those are a bit awkward to fit on Baba Yaga, but we'll get to that. First, let's talk about the ultimate, Home Sweet Home. This ability is slow. Everything about it is slow. The projectile fire rate at which you can throw fireballs is slow. The projectile speed is very slow. I don't know why, it just feels weird. They're super slow when they're flying across the map, and there's really no good reason for that. The fire patch that is created on the ground afterwards creeps very slowly, and it also has a short duration. And the ability in itself also feels counterintuitive, because the ability initially has a knockback, which is meant to create distance between you and the enemy, and that's a good thing I guess for a mage who have some self-peel. But this also means that in the whole animation of you going into the ult and the enemy being knocked back, the enemy can just decide to take the opportunity and walk away from you, because you're already knocking them back a relatively far distance anyways. And you know what will happen after that? They just run away. Because the fire damage, the fire projectiles can hardly catch up to them, you don't have any other movement increases, and they're already knocked back so far that they have sufficient distance to just, well, not even juke, but just run, and you really can't do much about that in most situations. So essentially the ult punishes you for using the ult correctly. The survivability while in the ultimate is not drastically increased. It feels risky in a similar way to, say, for example, Mulan's or Radiant's ultimate. You get a little bit of shield, yes, but outside of that you're still very vulnerable and you don't really have the same ways of avoiding damage anymore. This could facilitate different playstyles through going into more tank-heavy builds, But that's currently not really worth it due to the projectiles being so slow. Like, why would you build into a tank build when the most synergistic part of her kit is the weakest in many ways? Because of these circumstances, the damage on the ult is really hard to judge. It might actually be a very strong ability otherwise, and maybe it's good in a team fight where it's perfectly set up for you, the whole bunch of hard CCs on the enemies, and you can just throw your ult into them, but that's not the norm, at least. And that brings us to some general points. She has a severe lack of chase potential compared to almost anyone, because she only really gets slows if she's lucky. Her leap range is relatively short, and again, people can just run out of her ultimate in most situations. She might actually be above the point of balance if her bugs were fixed and the projectile speed on the 2 and ult was improved, even just slightly. And that makes her extremely hard to judge as a whole right now, especially as she is also such a high skill ceiling character, which I think is a good thing in her case. It just makes it very, very hard to tell as long as she's buggy and has some other mechanics that feel really wonky. It makes a massive difference in how much a character can do. I would also argue that her consumable slot usage on the 2 is a bit rough and seems unnecessary. It could just be stored in the passive, as currently it just takes up a consumable slot, which are very valuable, and it kind of discourages warding that way. The thing about Baba Yaga's kit that kind of irks me is how she's kind of encouraged to build Bruiser through percentage healing in her passive, through stacking items, which also works for defensive items, through the extra mitigation in 3 and through the shield in her ultimate. At the same time, she feels like she's designed to play as a very bursty mage. And I kinda can't piece the two together really. I don't know which way is the one that Hi-Rez wanted to go with this, because you can't really have both in most situations. It's gonna make it very interesting what she will do in solo compared to mid lane. So that's another spot where it's really hard to say where her balance really lies. For now, I will say that I hope Hi-Rez decides to open up PTS one more time, at least for a few days, in order to let us test her after her biggest bugs are fixed, because that would give us a much better idea of where she stands and would give Hi-Rez a better idea if there are any extra bugs that need to be fixed. And then she would probably feel much better on release already, which is something that should be in their best interest as well. That's my take on Baba Yaga so far. If you enjoyed this video and you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out and will notify you of future videos. Like, for example, one about the recent SPL games that I want to talk about, as well as a Loki video for the rework, and also still is SMITE growing. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you for the next one soon. DukeSloth out.